Some losses cut so deep they change the very fabric of who we are. For Daniel Hayes, losing his wife Sarah didn't just break his heart. It shattered his entire understanding of what life was supposed to mean. At 58, this successful CEO had built his world on logic and control. He ran one of the nation's largest consulting firms with ruthless efficiency. God was something he'd dismissed long ago as wishful thinking. When Sarah died 2 years earlier, even the funeral prayers felt empty to him. He threw himself back into work, believing that success and routine could fill the void she left behind. But some wounds refused to heal with time. The big house felt hollow. The executive achievements meant nothing. Daniel was drowning in his own silence. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed when a 7-year-old girl walked into his office. Her name was Emma, and she was clutching a small wooden cross. Her mother worked for his company and had brought her along during an emergency meeting. Emma looked up at this powerful man and said the words that would turn his world upside down. "You look sad, mister. Maybe God can help?" What happens when a child's innocent faith challenges a grown man's deepest beliefs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 47th floor of the Hayes Consulting Tower offered a view that most men would kill for. From Daniel's corner office, the city spread out like a chessboard, each building a piece he'd learned to manipulate over 3 decades in business. The morning sun caught the gold wedding ring on his left hand, a band he couldn't bring himself to remove. Though Sarah had been gone for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. Daniel adjusted his tie and settled into the leather chair that had cost more than most people's cars. The morning routine was sacred. Coffee at exactly 7:15, black, no sugar. Review of overnight emails. Market analysis. The rhythm of commerce that had sustained him since college, when he'd first discovered that numbers made more sense than people, and profit margins were more reliable than prayers. His assistant Margaret knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. Liberty earned through 15 years of impeccable service and an intuitive understanding of his moods. She was 62, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of quiet dignity that reminded him of his mother, though he rarely allowed such thoughts to surface. "Your 9 o'clock is here early," she said, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside his laptop. "Rebecca Chun from the Portland office. She's brought her daughter. Apparently the babysitter called in sick." Daniel frowned. He didn't like children in his office. They were unpredictable, messy, and spoke without filters. But Rebecca was one of their best project managers, and the quarterly review couldn't wait. "Send them in." Margaret hesitated at the door. "Daniel, if I may, you look tired. Perhaps you might consider taking some time off?" "I'm fine, Margaret." The words came out sharper than intended. She nodded and retreated, but not before he caught the worried look in her eyes. It was the same expression Sarah used to wear during those last months, when the cancer was winning and he was losing the only person who'd ever seen past his carefully constructed walls. The office felt larger. After Margaret left, the silence amplified by the city's distant hum. Daniel turned back to his computer, but the spreadsheet blurred slightly. He removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. The insomnia was getting worse. Each night brought the same routine, falling asleep easily, then waking at 3 a.m. to an empty house that echoed with memories he couldn't quite silence. The penthouse on Riverside Drive had been Sarah's dream home. She'd spent months choosing every detail: the marble countertops, the hardwood floors, the bay windows that caught the afternoon light just so. "We'll grow old here," she'd said, her eyes bright with plans for dinner parties and holiday gatherings. That would never come to pass. Now the rooms felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had ended too soon. Daniel had met Sarah at a church social when he was 25. Fresh out of business school, and convinced he could conquer the world through sheer determination. She was teaching Sunday school to a group of restless 8-year-olds, her patience infinite, her laugh infectious. He'd gone to that church exactly once, dragged there by a roommate who was dating a girl in the choir. But Sarah had made it, worth the uncomfortable hour on a hard pew. Their courtship had been a study in opposites. She believed in miracles. He believed in strategic planning. She saw God's hand in coincidences. He saw market opportunities in chaos. Yet somehow they built 32 years of marriage on that foundation of beautiful contradiction. She'd stopped asking him to attend services after the first decade, though she never stopped hoping. He'd seen it in her eyes during grace at dinner, heard it in her bedtime prayers that she thought he couldn't hear through the bathroom door. The diagnosis had come on a Tuesday, delivered by Dr. Morrison with the practiced gentleness of a man who'd broken similar news 1,000 times. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment. Sarah had taken the news with characteristic grace, immediately asking about pain management and how to tell their friends. Daniel had focused on second opinions, experimental treatments, anything that might change the trajectory that statistics insisted was inevitable. She died on a Thursday morning in March, with spring rain pattering against the hospice window, and her hand warm in his. Her last coherent words had been about finding his way back to believing, though what she wanted him to believe in remained frustratingly unclear. Faith? Love? The possibility that their story wasn't really over? He'd nodded and promised, the way men promise dying wives anything, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The funeral had been everything Sarah would have wanted: flowers from her garden, hymns she'd hummed while cooking, stories that celebrated her kindness. Pastor Williams had spoken about eternal rest and resurrection hope, but the words bounced off Daniel like rain on glass. If there was a God, he had taken the best person Daniel knew while leaving the world full of people who deserved nothing. The mathematics of that equation had never made sense. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Rebecca Chun entered with careful steps, professional in her navy suit and apologetic smile. Behind her came a small girl with dark pigtails and curious eyes, clutching something in her hand. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for seeing us on such short notice. This is my daughter, Emma. Emma, can you say hello to Mr. Hayes?" The child stepped forward with the fearless directness that only 7-year-olds possess. "Hello, mister. You have a very tall building." She looked around the office with undisguised wonder, taking in the awards on the walls and the city view beyond. "Do you live up here?" "No, Emma. This is where I work. Your mother and I need to discuss some business matters. Perhaps you could sit quietly while we talk." But Emma wasn't looking at the chairs Rebecca indicated. Instead, she was studying Daniel's face with uncomfortable intensity. Children had an unsettling ability to see things adults had learned to ignore or politely overlook. After a long moment, she stepped closer to his desk and placed something small on the leather blotter. It was a wooden cross, no bigger than a thumb, hanging from a simple chain. The wood was worn smooth, as if it had been handled often. "You look sad, mister," Emma said with matter-of-fact sympathy. "Maybe God can help?" The office went completely quiet. Rebecca's face flushed crimson, and she moved quickly to retrieve her daughter. "Emma, no. Mr. Hayes doesn't. I'm so sorry, sir." She doesn't understand. But Daniel held up a hand, his attention fixed on the small girl, who had just offered him the kind of simple solution that his complicated adult mind immediately rejected. Yet something in her expression, the genuine concern, the innocent conviction that problems could be solved with faith, stirred a memory he thought he'd buried. His own mother had worn a cross just like this one, silver instead of wood, tucked beneath her work blouses where only family could see it. She'd kissed it before every family crisis, his father's layoffs, his brother Thomas's asthma attacks, The lean years when groceries were counted carefully and Christmas was more about presents than presents. God provides, she'd always said, and somehow, despite all logic, he usually had. Thomas. Daniel hadn't spoken to his younger brother in over 3 years. Not since the argument after Sarah's funeral, when Thomas had tried to offer comfort through Scripture, and Daniel had responded with the kind of cutting remarks that severed relationships. Thomas was a pastor now in some small Indiana town, probably still believing with the same uncomplicated faith that had sustained their mother through decades of worry. "Thank you, Emma," Daniel heard himself saying. "That's very thoughtful," Emma beamed, satisfied with his response. Rebecca looked relieved but still embarrassed, gathering her papers with quick efficiency. They conducted their business review. In record time, Rebecca's team was exceeding targets. The Portland office was profitable, all metrics trending positive. The kind of news that should have satisfied Daniel completely. But as Rebecca prepared to leave, gathering Emma's coloring books and promising her ice cream if she'd been good, Daniel found himself reluctant to let them go. The office would return to its familiar silence, the city to its impersonal sprawl. The wooden cross sat on his desk like a question mark, reflecting the afternoon light. "Rebecca," he said as they reached the door. "Your daughter, she seems very thoughtful for her age." Rebecca's expression softened. She asked a lot of questions, about everything. Sometimes it's exhausting, but she glanced down at Emma, who was studying a framed photo of Daniel and Sarah from their anniversary trip to Tuscany. She notices when people are hurting. She gets that from her father, I think. The way Rebecca said "father" suggested a story with complications, perhaps an ending not unlike Daniel's own. He wanted to ask but didn't. Personal questions were territory he'd learned to avoid, first in business, then in life. Safer to keep relationships professional, manageable, contained within appropriate boundaries. After they left, Daniel picked up the wooden cross. It was lighter than he'd expected, warm from Emma's small hands. He held it to the window, watching the grain catch the light, trying to remember the last time he touched anything connected to faith. Sarah's bedside prayers, perhaps, when he'd held her hand during those final weeks and felt the movement of her lips against his palm. Margaret appeared with the afternoon mail, her eyes noting the cross but making no comment. She'd worked for him long enough to recognize the signs of internal weather changes, the subtle shifts that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. She sorted the correspondence with practiced efficiency, leaving the most important items on top. "Will there be anything else today, Daniel?" He looked up from the cross, realizing he'd been staring at it for several minutes. "Margaret, do you—" He started to ask if she attended church, then stopped. Personal questions were a two-way street, and he wasn't prepared for the return journey. "Do I what?" "Nothing. Thank you for staying late with the Chun review." She nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Daniel, if you don't mind me saying, that little girl was right. You do look sad. Have for a long time now." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with Emma's gift and the uncomfortable realization that a 7-year-old had seen through facades that he'd spent decades perfecting. He'd placed the cross in his desk drawer, next to Sarah's reading glasses and a bottle of antacids that had become essential for managing the stress he claimed not to feel. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, painting the office in shades of amber and gold. Time to go home to the empty house. The prepared dinner he'd eat while reading financial reports. The hours of television that would fill the space between dinner and another restless night. The same routine he'd followed for 2 years, 3 months and 16 days. But as Daniel gathered his papers and straightened his tie, he found himself wondering what Emma saw when she looked at him. What kind of sadness was so obvious that a child felt compelled to offer wooden crosses and suggestions about divine intervention? And perhaps more disturbing, where she was right about more than just his sadness. The wooden cross seemed to pulse with possibility in his peripheral vision. But Daniel closed the drawer firmly and headed for the elevator. Some questions were safer left unasked, especially when the answers might require him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world, about loss, and about the possibility that maybe he'd been wrong about more than he cared to admit. The encounter with Emma lingered in Daniel's mind like smoke from a distant fire, present but intangible, carrying sense of something he couldn't quite identify. Throughout the week, he found himself opening his desk drawer to look at the wooden cross, then closing it quickly as if the simple object might somehow contaminate his carefully ordered world with unpredictable variables. Friday evening found him in Sarah's walk-in closet, something he'd been avoiding for months. The cleaning service had offered to handle this task, but Daniel had declined. Some territories required personal navigation, even when the journey promised to be treacherous. Her clothes still carried the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd hidden throughout the closet, a detail so typically Sarah that his throat tightened with unexpected grief. He'd grown comfortable with the dull ache that had replaced the sharp pain of early loss. But tonight something felt different, raw, as if Emma's simple question had scraped away scar tissue he hadn't realized was protecting him. The jewelry box, set on Sarah's vanity, untouched since the funeral. Daniel opened it slowly, steeling himself against the familiar contents. Her grandmother's pearls, the diamond earrings he'd given her for their 20th anniversary, the simple gold band that had matched his own. But nestled in the corner, beneath a tangle of costing jewelry, his fingers found something unexpected. A hospital bracelet. White plastic with black printing. Sarah Hayes, admitted, September 15th. Dr. Morrison, oncology. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the bracelet to the light. September 15th. That was 3 weeks before Sarah had told him about the diagnosis. 3 weeks before that terrible Tuesday when their world had officially begun to end. Why would she have kept this? And why had she hidden it here, among treasures she'd planned to pass down to children they'd never had? The memory hit him with unexpected force. Sarah in the kitchen that morning, humming while she made his coffee. He'd been rushing, focused on a merger that seemed critically important at the time. She'd kissed his cheek and said something about seeing Dr. Morrison for her annual checkup. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested their last year of normal life was already over. But it had been over, hadn't it? While he'd been negotiating contracts and managing portfolios, Sarah had been carrying a secret that must have felt like stones in her pockets. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the countdown that had already begun without his knowledge. Daniel sank into Sarah's reading chair, the hospital bracelet cutting into his palm. 3 weeks. She'd known for 3 weeks and said nothing. Had she prayed during those nights when he thought she was sleeping peacefully beside him? Had she bargained with God in the darkness, asking for more time? Or had she simply asked for strength to face what was coming? The questions opened floodgates he'd kept sealed since the funeral. Sarah's faith had been quiet but constant, woven through their marriage like background music he'd learned to ignore. She'd attended services, faithfully volunteered with the youth group, sent cards to church members facing their own crises. He'd viewed her devotion with the tolerant amusement of someone watching a harmless hobby, never imagining it might be the foundation that had held her together when everything else began to crumble. Now, holding evidence of her private suffering, he felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart that had been broken long ago. Something deeper. The bedrock certainty that had sustained him through grief. The unshakable conviction that Sarah's death had been meaningless. Random. One more proof that the universe operated on chaos rather than design. What if he'd been wrong? What if Sarah's quiet faith had been more than wishful thinking? What if those 3 weeks of silent knowledge had been filled with prayers that weren't just desperate bargaining, but genuine conversation with someone who was listening? Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message, jarring him back to the present. Margaret. Daniel, I know it's late, but I wanted you to know that I'll be praying for you. You seem troubled today. Margaret praying for him. Just like Emma offering her cross. Just like Sarah whispering into the darkness those final months. Words he'd assumed were delirium, but now wondered might have been intercession. He stood abruptly, the hospital bracelet falling to the carpet. The closet felt suddenly claustrophobic, filled with too many memories and too many questions he'd spent 2 years avoiding. He needed air, space, the familiar territory of his office, where everything made sense and emotions could be managed through spreadsheets and strategic planning. The drive downtown took 45 minutes through light traffic. The building was mostly empty except for security and the cleaning crew, but Daniel's key card still worked after hours. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending to sanctuary, a high-end place where he controlled the variables and faith was limited to confidence in quarterly projections. But Emma's wooden cross was still in his desk drawer, and Sarah's hospital bracelet was still clenched in his fist. He sat in his chair and stared at the city lights, trying to process the collision between the life he'd thought they'd lived and the reality that was emerging like a photograph and developing solution. Sarah had known she was dying while he'd been planning their retirement trip to Ireland. She'd been facing eternity while he'd been worried about market volatility. The mathematical precision of his worldview suddenly seemed inadequate, like trying to measure love with a ruler or capture. Grief in a profit-loss statement. His computer chimed with an email from Thomas, the first communication from his brother in over 3 years. The subject line read, "Thinking of you." Daniel hesitated before opening it. Thomas had tried to reach out after Sarah's funeral, offering comfort that Daniel had rejected with the kind of brutal finality that burned bridges. What could his pastor, brother possibly saying now that would be different? Daniel, the message began. I know we haven't spoken since Sarah's service, and I understand why. I said things the day that came from love, but probably sounded like judgment. I'm sorry for that. I've been thinking about you lately, especially with the anniversary of Sarah's passing approaching. I know you don't share my faith, but I want you to know that I've been praying for you. Not that you'd become religious or attend church, but simply that you'd find peace. Sarah called me a few weeks before she died. Did you know that? She was worried about you, about how you'd handle losing her. She made me promise to keep trying to reach you, even if you pushed me away. This email is me keeping that promise. You don't have to respond. I just wanted you to know that someone is thinking of you, praying for you, hoping that wherever you are in your journey, you're not walking alone. Love always, Thomas. Peace. Sarah mentioned that you kept Mom's old Bible in the attic. If you ever want to talk about anything at all, I'm here. Daniel stared at the screen until the words blurred. Sarah had called Thomas. Of course she had. In those 3 weeks of secret knowledge, she'd been putting pieces in place, making arrangements that extended beyond funeral plans and estate documents. She'd been thinking about his spiritual welfare, orchestrating connections that might catch him when he finally fell. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant Sarah had been protecting him even while facing her own mortality. Terrifying because it suggested a level of divine orchestration that his rational mind couldn't easily dismiss. Emma's cross, Margaret's prayers, Thomas's email coincidences, or something more intentional. Daniel's reflection was interrupted by the sound of the cleaning crew in the hallway. Through his office window, he watched the late-night city dwellers, moving through their private dramas, couples arguing on street corners, solitary figures hurrying toward unknown destinations. The beautiful loneliness of urban life playing out in lighted windows across the skyline. He'd been one of those solitary figures for 2 years, moving through routines that provided structure without meaning, success without satisfaction. The hospital bracelet in his palm felt like a key to a door he'd been afraid to open. And Emma's cross seemed to pulse with possibility in his desk drawer. For the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel allowed himself to consider the possibility that his grief might be more than random loss, that his loneliness might be more than the natural result of circumstance. What if the emptiness he'd been filling with work and routine was actually hunger? What if the questions Emma had stirred weren't dangerous, but necessary? He pulled out his phone and stared at Thomas's email for a long time. His fingers hovered over the reply button, then moved away. Some bridges, once burned, required careful reconstruction. But perhaps Sarah had been right to worry about him walking alone. The city lights blurred his tears. He'd been holding for 2 years. 3 months and 17 days finally found their way to the surface. Daniel Hayes, who had built empires on logic and conquered markets through reason, sat in his tower office and wept for his wife, for his isolation, and for the faith he'd lost so long ago that he'd forgotten what it felt like to believe in anything. Beyond the next quarterly report, when the tears stopped, he opened his desk drawer and held Emma's wooden cross up to the light. Such a small thing to carry such weight. Such a simple gesture to crack such carefully constructed walls. Maybe God could help. Maybe that wasn't the ridiculous proposition he'd always assumed it to be. Maybe a 7-year-old girl understood something about sadness and healing that a 58-year-old CEO had forgotten. Daniel placed the cross next to Sarah's hospital bracelet on his desk and began composing a response to Thomas. It was time to stop walking alone. The weekend brought a restlessness Daniel hadn't felt in years. Saturday morning found him standing in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, now a guest room in the house he'd inherited from his parents 15 years ago. He'd kept the property mostly out of sentiment and convenience. It was paid for, and selling it had seemed like unnecessary paperwork. Now he realized he'd been avoiding it for deeper reasons. The house on Maple Street held too many memories, too many echoes of the boy he'd been before business school and corporate ambition had reshaped him into someone his parents might not have recognized. Daniel climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step creaking with familiarity. The dusty space smelled of old wood and forgotten seasons. Cardboard boxes stacked like monuments to a simpler time. He found what he was looking for in the third box, a leather-bound Bible, worn soft by decades of handling. His mother's handwriting filled the margins, notes from sermons, questions about passages that had puzzled her, dates marking significant moments in their family's spiritual journey. Christmas 1978. Daniel accepted Jesus at the children's service. His confirmation date, Thomas's baptism. His father's recovery from surgery, marked with a simple, "Thank you, Lord," in his mother's careful script. Daniel settled onto an old trunk and opened the Bible to Genesis. The pages felt fragile between his fingers, tissue-thin paper that had been turned by loving hands countless times. He remembered sitting in the front pew at First Methodist, fidgeting in his Sunday clothes while Pastor Reynolds read from this same book. The stories had seemed like fairy tales, then talking snakes and floating arks and men who walked on water. Now, reading his mother's marginal notes about faith in dark times, they felt different. Less like fiction and more like letters from people who had wrestled with questions he was only now beginning to ask. A photograph fell from between the pages of Psalms. Daniel and Thomas's boys, maybe 8 and 6, standing beside their parents outside the church after Easter service. They were all dressed in their best clothes, squinting into the sun, looking like the kind of family that believed in divine providence and Sunday pot roast. His mother wore her silver cross, the one Emma's wooden version had reminded him of. His father's hand rested on Thomas's shoulder with the easy affection of a man who saw God's goodness in simple moments. What had happened to that boy who'd accepted Jesus at the children's service? When had certainty given way to skepticism? Faith to calculated risk management? The transformation hadn't been sudden, more like erosion, with college philosophy classes and business school pragmatism wearing away beliefs that had once seemed as solid as bedrock. The sound of his phone ringing downstairs interrupted his reflection. Daniel climbed down from the attic, dusting cobwebs from his clothes, and found Margaret's number on the caller ID. "I hope I'm not disturbing your weekend," she said, but Rebecca Chan called. She wanted to thank you personally for being so kind to Emma, and she asked if I thought you might like to join them for lunch tomorrow after church. I told her I'd pass along the invitation. Church. The word hit him like a physical sensation, carrying weight and possibility in equal measure. Did she say which church? Community Fellowship on Riverside. It's a small congregation, mostly families with children. Rebecca says Emma has been talking about you all week, asking if the sad man found Jesus yet. Daniel almost smiled at that. Trust a 7-year-old to reduce complex theological questions to simple terms. What did you tell her about lunch? I said I'd ask you. Margaret's voice carried carefully neutral tones, but Daniel could hear the hope underneath. Daniel, if you don't mind me saying, you've seemed different this week. Lighter somehow. Had he? Daniel considered this as he wandered through the empty house. Perhaps the crushing weight he'd carried since Sarah's death had shifted slightly, allowing room for something besides grief and routine. Not healing exactly, but the possibility that healing might be possible. Tell Rebecca I'll think about it, he said finally. I will. And Daniel? I think Sarah would be pleased. After Margaret hung up, Daniel returned to the attic and his mother's Bible. He turned to the Psalms, reading passages that had comforted generations of believers facing loss and uncertainty. Psalm 23 was heavily underlined, with a date in the T. Margin. Dad's heart attack, 1985. God's peace in the hospital waiting room. His father had survived that heart attack, lived another 12 years, filled with grandchildren he'd never have and retirement dreams that came true. At the time, Daniel had attributed his father's recovery to good medical care and his mother's vigilant nursing. Now he wondered if there had been other factors at work, invisible hands guiding healing in ways that medical science couldn't measure or explain. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made staying in bed seem reasonable and spiritual contemplation seem unnecessary. Daniel dressed carefully, choosing a suit that suggested respect without ostentation. He hadn't been inside a church for anything besides weddings and funerals in 20 years, but he imagined certain protocols still applied. Community Fellowship occupied a modest building on Riverside, its red brick exterior speaking of practical faith rather than architectural ambition. Cars filled the small parking lot, family sedans and economy models, the transportation of people who budgeted carefully and saved for vacations that might never come. Daniel's BMW looked conspicuous among them, a reminder that he existed in different economic territory than most believers. He sat in his car for 10 minutes, watching families stream through the entrance. Children clutched coloring books and small Bibles. Parents balanced diaper bags and coffee cups. Teenagers walked with the peculiar combination of reluctance and curiosity that characterized adolescent spirituality. All of them seemed to know exactly where they belonged, what they believed, why they were there. Daniel felt like an anthropologist observing an unfamiliar culture, trying to decode behaviors that had once been as natural as breathing. The wooden cross Emma had given him was in his jacket pocket. He'd taken to carrying it, though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps as a talisman, perhaps as a reminder that some questions were worth asking, even when the answers felt impossibly distant. Just as he was considering leaving, Rebecca appeared beside his car window, Emma bouncing excitedly beside her. Both wore simple dresses and welcoming smiles that made retreat impossible. "Mr. Hayes, you came." Emma's enthusiasm was infectious. her joy at seeing him genuine and uncomplicated. "Mommy said you might come to Jesus Church with us." "Jesus Church," Daniel repeated, amused despite his nervousness. "Is that what you call it?" "That's what they talk about mostly," Emma explained with 7-year-old logic. "Jesus and how to be nice to people. Are you going to sit with us?" Before Daniel could formulate a response that didn't commit him to anything specific, Rebecca took his arm gently. "We'd love to have you sit with us, if you're comfortable with that. Fair warning, Emma likes to ask questions during the service." The sanctuary was smaller than the churches of Daniel's childhood, with simple wooden pews and stained glass windows that caught what little sunlight filtered through the gray morning. Maybe 150 people filled the space, creating an atmosphere of intimate community rather than anonymous worship. Daniel found himself seated between Rebecca and Emma, close enough to the front that escape would require awkward explanation. Pastor Williams, not the same man who had presided over Daniel's childhood faith, but someone cut from similar cloth, welcomed the congregation with the kind of warmth that suggested he knew most of their names and many of their struggles. His sermon was about doubt, about the disciples' questions following Jesus' resurrection, about faith that coexisted with uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Thomas needed to touch the wounds before he could believe, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying across the quiet sanctuary. God didn't rebuke him for that. He provided the evidence Thomas needed. Sometimes faith isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it's about being willing to ask the questions. Emma leaned against Daniel's arm during the sermon, occasionally whispering observations that were surprisingly insightful. "Pastor Jim is talking about the man who needed to see Jesus' hurts," she said quietly. "Like when you need to see something to believe it's real. Like hospital bracelets and margins in Bibles," Daniel thought. Like wooden crosses offered by children who saw sadness where adults learned to hide it. Like brothers who kept reaching across years of silence because promises to dying wives carried weight that transcended hurt feelings. The service ended with a hymn Daniel remembered from childhood, "Amazing Grace," sung by voices that knew the words by heart and meant them, with the kind of conviction that comes from experience rather than obligation. He found himself following along, muscle memory supplying lyrics he'd assumed were forgotten. Afterward, Emma introduced him to various church members with the proprietary pride of someone who had personally delivered him to salvation. "This is Mr. Hayes," she announced to anyone who would listen. "He has a very tall building, and he used to be sad, but now he's learning about Jesus." The simplicity of her explanation embarrassed and charmed him equally. Adults would have required complex theological discussions and careful doctrinal disclaimers. Emma reduced his spiritual journey to its essential elements: sadness, search, and the possibility of hope found in community. Lunch at Rebecca's apartment was a study in gracious hospitality, operating within careful budget constraints. The meal was simple, but prepared with attention to detail that reminded Daniel of his mother's Sunday dinners. Emma chattered throughout the meal about school and friends and the hamster she was hoping to get for her birthday. Normal childhood concerns that somehow felt miraculous in their ordinariness. "She talks about you at home," Rebecca told him while Emma was distracted by a puzzle. "She says you need friends." Children see things we adults sometimes miss. "What do you see?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I see someone who's been carrying a heavy load alone for too long. Someone who's forgotten that burdens can be shared." She glanced toward Emma, who was humming while she worked on her puzzle. "Emma's father left when she was 3. For a long time, I carried that rejection and disappointment like stones in my pockets. The church community here taught me that healing happens in relationship with God, yes, but also with people who care about your well-being." It was the first time Rebecca had mentioned Emma's father, and Daniel sensed the trust involved in sharing that information. How did you find your way back to faith after something like that? The same way you're finding yours now, I think. One small step at a time, with people who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. She smiled, watching Emma complete her puzzle with determined concentration. Sometimes God uses children to remind us what simple faith looks like. Emma knew you needed kindness before I did. As Daniel prepared to leave, Emma presented him with another gift, a crayon drawing of two figures standing under what appeared to be a cross. One figure was tall and wore a tie. The other was small with pigtails. "That's you and me at Jesus Church," she explained. "I drew it so you won't forget that God likes you." The drawing was crude in the way that all 7-year-old artwork is crude. But something about it, the careful attention to details like his tie, the bright yellow sun in the corner, the obvious love that had guided small fingers holding oversized crayons, made his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Emma. I won't forget." On the drive home, Daniel found himself thinking about Pastor Williams's sermon on doubt and faith coexisting, about Thomas needing evidence before believing, about the possibility that questions weren't obstacles to faith, but invitations to deeper understanding. The family Bible was waiting in his study, full of his mother's questions and discoveries. Thomas's email remained unanswered but not forgotten. Emma's drawing lay beside him on the passenger seat, a child's vision of community and belonging. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel Hayes allowed himself to consider the possibility that he wasn't walking alone after all, that the sadness Emma had recognized might not be permanent, and that the wooden cross in his pocket might be pointing towards something larger than his own carefully controlled world. The Monday morning after his first church service in decades brought an unexpected restlessness to Daniel's routine. The familiar rhythm of coffee and market reports felt somehow insufficient, as if he'd been surviving on breadcrumbs without realizing a feast was available. Emma's drawing hung on his office wall now, professionally framed, a splash of childhood wonder among his business awards and corporate achievements. Margaret noticed the drawing immediately when she arrived with his morning correspondence. She paused before it for a long moment, her expression softening in ways that reminded Daniel how little he actually knew about the people who orbited his professional life. "Emma's artwork?" she asked. "A reminder," Daniel said, though he couldn't fully articulate what he was being reminded of. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility that his story wasn't finished yet. "I have something for you," Margaret said, producing a manila envelope from her briefcase. "I found these while organizing my files this weekend. Letters from your brother that arrived over the years. You were always too busy for personal mail, so I handled your correspondence as I saw fit. I hope you'll forgive the presumption." The envelope contained nearly a dozen letters, postmarked from Millfield, Indiana, spanning the 3 years since Sarah's funeral. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he examined the careful handwriting on each envelope. Thomas's distinctive script, unchanged since their childhood. "You kept them?" "I kept hoping you'd eventually want to read them," Margaret admitted. "Your brother is a persistent man. He never stopped trying to reach you." After Margaret left, Daniel spread the letters across his desk chronologically. The earliest was dated 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, when grief had been so raw that Daniel could barely function, let alone process emotional overtures from the brother he'd wounded with his anger. "Dear Daniel," the first letter began, "I know you're hurting, and I know my words at Sarah's service came across as platitudes rather than comfort. I've been thinking about what I should have said instead. Maybe just that I love you, and I'm sorry for your loss, and Sarah was one of the finest people I've ever known. She called me the week before she died. Did I mention that? She was worried. About you, about how you'd handle being alone. She made me promise to keep trying to reach you, even if you pushed me away. This letter is me keeping that promise." Daniel's throat tightened. Sarah had orchestrated these connections, these lifelines. she'd known he would need. Even in her final days, she'd been thinking about his spiritual welfare, arranging for care that would extend beyond her physical presence. The subsequent letters painted a picture of Thomas's life in Millfield, a small farming community where everyone knew their neighbors' struggles and celebrations. He wrote about his congregation, about baptisms and funerals and the ordinary miracles that sustained small-town faith. He wrote about their parents, sharing memories Daniel had forgotten, their mother singing hymns while hanging laundry, their father's quiet prayers before family meals, the way faith had been woven through their childhood like background music. Do you remember when you broke your arm falling out of the maple tree? One letter asked. You were 8, and you were so brave at the hospital, but that night you cried because you thought God was punishing you for climbing too high. Mom sat with you for hours, explaining that accidents weren't punishment, that God grieved when his children hurt. You asked her how she knew that, and she said, because I'm a mother, and I know how mothers feel when their babies are hurting. God loves you even more than I do. I think about that conversation often when I'm counseling. People who've convinced themselves that their pain is evidence of divine abandonment. The memory surfaced with startling clarity. Daniel could almost feel his mother's cool hand on his forehead, hear her voice explaining divine love in terms an 8-year-old could understand. When had he stopped believing that God grieved with human suffering? When had loss become evidence of absence rather than presence? A knock on his office door interrupted his reading. Rebecca Chun entered with Emma, who was carrying a construction paper card decorated with glitter and stickers. We brought you a thank you card, Emma announced, presenting her artwork with ceremony, for coming to Jesus Church with us. Mommy helped me spell the big words. The card's cover featured Emma's drawing of a church with stick figures standing outside. Inside, in carefully formed letters, thank you, Mr. Hayes, for coming to church. Jesus is happy you visited. Love, Emma. P.S. Do you want to come again? What do you think, Emma? Daniel asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Should I come again? Yes, she said, without hesitation. Pastor Jim tells good stories, and Mrs. Patterson always has cookies after. And maybe if you keep coming, you won't look sad anymore. Rebecca smiled apologetically. Subtlety isn't her strong suit. But she's not wrong. You do seem different. More present somehow. Present. Daniel considered the word. For 2 years, he'd been going through motions without truly inhabiting his life. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The routine had provided structure, but not meaning, survival, but not purpose. Emma's simple invitation to church had cracked something open, allowing possibility to seep in like light through curtains. I have a question. For you, Emma, Daniel said, settling into his chair. You told me that God could help when I was sad. How did you know that? Emma's face grew serious, as if she understood the importance of the question. Because God helped Mommy when Daddy went away. She cried a lot, and then we started going to church, and she stopped crying so much. Pastor Jim says God fixes broken hearts, but it takes time, like when you hurt your knee and it gets better, but you can't see it happening. The theology was simple, but Daniel found it more compelling than the complex doctrinal discussions he remembered from his youth. God as divine physician, healing is gradual process. Time is necessary ingredient for restoration. It aligned with his business understanding of long-term investment and gradual return. After Rebecca and Emma left, Daniel returned to Thomas's letters. The most recent, dated just 2 weeks ago, contained news that stopped him cold. I wanted you to know that I've been diagnosed with diabetes, Thomas wrote. Nothing dramatic type 2. Manageable with medication and diet changes. But it's made me think about mortality, about the conversations we never had after Sarah's funeral, about the time we've lost the pride and hurt feelings. I don't want to leave this world with unfinished business between us. I love you, Daniel. I always have. Sarah knew that, even when you couldn't feel it. She made me promise to keep reaching out, and I intend to honor that promise until one of us can't anymore. Daniel reached for his phone before he could reconsider. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the warm cadences of someone who'd spent decades offering comfort to others. "Daniel? Is that really you? It's me." The words came out rough, unused to expressing vulnerability. "I got your letters, all of them. I should have called sooner. You called when you were ready. That's what matters." They talked for an hour, carefully at first, then with growing ease. Thomas shared details about his congregation, about the rhythms of rural ministry, about the way faith played out in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Daniel found himself describing Emma, the wooden cross, the church service that had stirred memories he'd thought were buried. Beyond recovery. "Sarah was right to worry about you," Thomas said gently. "She knew you'd try to handle grief like a business problem, analyze it, manage it, control it until it's submitted to your will. But some things can't be conquered. They have to be surrendered." "I don't know how to surrender," Daniel admitted. "I built my entire life on control, on making things happen through planning and persistence." "Maybe that's where Emma comes in," Thomas suggested. "Children are natural surrenderers. They trust without guarantees, love without contracts, believe in possibilities that adults dismiss as impractical." That evening, Daniel sat in his study with his mother's Bible open to the Psalms. The margins were filled with his parents' spiritual journey questions, insights, moments of doubt and breakthrough documented in fading ink. He found a passage in Psalm 34 that his mother had underlined heavily. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Close to the brokenhearted. Daniel's heart had been broken for 2 years, shattered by loss and calcified by isolation. If the psalmist was right, if his mother's faith had been grounded in truth rather than wishful thinking, then perhaps his brokenness wasn't evidence of divine absence, but invitation for divine presence. He picked up his pen and wrote in the margin, beside his mother's underlining, "Daniel Hayes, November 15th, beginning to hope again." It was a small notation, tentative and qualified, but it was the first time in 2 years that he documented hope rather than loss, possibility rather than resignation. Emma's wooden cross caught the lamplight from its place on his desk, and her crayon drawing smiled down at him from the wall. Maybe God could help after all. Maybe a 7-year-old girl understood something about healing that a 58-year-old CEO was finally ready to learn. Outside his study window, the city, lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing someone's story of struggle and search, loss and recovery. Daniel Hayes was no longer walking alone through that landscape. He had Emma's innocent wisdom, Rebecca's quiet strength, Margaret's faithful prayers, and Thomas's persistent love. Most importantly, he had the growing suspicion that all of these connections weren't coincidental, but orchestrated by hands that had been guiding his journey, long before he'd been willing to acknowledge their presence. For the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel fell asleep without the aid of prescription medication. His mother's Bible open beside him, Thomas's letters scattered across his desk like breadcrumbs marking a path home. The discovery came 3 weeks later, hidden behind Sarah's jewelry box in a compartment Daniel had never noticed. His fingers had been searching for her grandmother's brooch, something to include in a memorial donation to the church when they brushed against what felt like a small book wedged into the narrow space between the wall and the vanity. Sarah's journal, leather-bound, filled with her careful handwriting, dated entries spanning the final year of her life. Daniel's hands shook as he carried it to their bedroom reading chair, the same place where he processed so many other revelations about the woman he'd thought he'd known completely. The first entry was dated 14 months before her death. "Had coffee with Margaret today. She mentioned that Daniel seems more distant lately, working longer hours, coming home exhausted but restless. I've been praying about this for months. He's lost his way spiritually, and I don't know how to help him find it. How do you love someone back to faith? How do you share hope with someone who's convinced that hope is naive? Daniel stopped reading, overwhelmed by the realization that Sarah had been watching his spiritual decline with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else in their marriage. He thought his growing cynicism about faith was invisible, a private evolution from the religious certainty of his youth to the practical atheism of his professional life. But Sarah had seen it all: the gradual replacement of Sunday services with business meetings, the way he'd stopped participating in grace before meals, the silence that replaced prayer in their bedtime routine. He turned the page, steeling himself for more difficult revelations. Daniel laughed today when I mentioned Mrs. Henderson's prayer chain for her grandson in Afghanistan. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind of dismissive chuckle he reserves for things he considers superstitious. It breaks my heart. The man I married believed in miracles. He prayed with me during Dad's cancer scare, trusted God with our infertility struggles, found comfort in Scripture during his mother's final months. When did doubt become his default position? When did faith become something he tolerated in me rather than shared with me? The entries painted a picture of spiritual loneliness that Daniel had never suspected. Sarah had continued attending church alone, volunteering for committees he'd stopped supporting, maintaining friendships with people who shared beliefs he'd abandoned. She'd been walking a parallel spiritual path, hoping he would eventually choose to join her, but never pressuring him to change. Saw Dr. Morrison today for what I thought was a routine appointment. The test suggests something more serious: pancreatic irregularities that require further investigation. I'm trying not to panic, but I can't stop thinking about Daniel. If something happens to me, what will happen to his soul? He's built such walls around his heart, convinced himself that faith is weakness rather than strength. Lord, if I'm facing something terminal, please use whatever time I have left to plant seeds that might bloom after I'm gone. Daniel's vision blurred as he read about Sarah's private terror, not just for her own mortality, but for his spiritual welfare. Even facing potential death, she'd been more concerned about his relationship with God than her own prognosis. The entries following her diagnosis were filled with prayers that took his breath away. Prayers for his peace, his healing from the cynicism that had hardened his heart, his eventual return to the faith that had once anchored his life. She'd been interceding for his spiritual journey while battling cancer, storing up hope for his future while planning for her own death. 3 months to live, maybe 6 with treatment. I've made my peace with dying. I know where I'm going, and I'm not afraid. But Daniel terrifies me. He's going to try to handle grief the same way he handles business crisis, through control and analysis and sheer force of will. He doesn't understand that some things can't be conquered, only surrendered to. I've been praying for people who will be there for him after I'm gone, believers who will love him through his doubt and anger. A soft knock interrupted his reading. Margaret stood in the bedroom doorway, concern etched across her features. Daniel, you've been up here for 2 hours. You missed your afternoon meetings. He held up the journal. Did you know about this? Did Sarah ever mention that she was praying for you? Margaret's expression softened. She mentioned it almost every time we talked. She was deeply concerned about your spiritual life, especially during those final months. She prayed for people to be there for me after she was gone. Margaret nodded slowly. I was one of them. She asked me specifically to watch over you, to pray for opportunities to remind you that you weren't walking alone. Emma's visit that day wasn't coincidence, Daniel. Rebecca had been asking for months about bringing her daughter to the office. I finally said yes because I'd been praying for an opening in your heart. The revelation was simultaneously comforting and overwhelming. Sarah had been orchestrating his spiritual care from her deathbed, recruiting prayer warriors who would tend to his soul after she could no longer do so herself. Margaret's faithful presence, Rebecca's gentle friendship, Emma's innocent wisdom, all of it had been set in motion by a dying woman's love. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. She wrote letters for special occasions, difficult days, moments when she thought you might need her voice. "I've been keeping them, waiting for the right times to share them." Letters? Margaret reached into her purse and produced an envelope addressed in Sarah's handwriting. "For Daniel, when he starts asking questions about faith." Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. Sarah's voice seemed to speak from the page. "My darling husband, if you're reading this, it means you've begun the journey back to believing. I'm so proud of you for having the courage to ask questions, to admit that maybe there's more to existence than spreadsheets and strategic planning. Do you remember our third date when we walked through Central Park and you told me about losing your childhood faith? You said it felt like losing a best friend, someone you trusted completely until you discovered they might not exist. I told you then that faith wasn't about certainty, but about relationship, about choosing to believe that love is stronger than death, that hope is more powerful than despair, that we're part of a story bigger than our individual chapters. I never stopped believing that story included you, even when you stopped believing it yourself. I prayed every day that you would find your way back, not to rules and regulations, but to the love that created you, sustains you, and will welcome you home when this life is finished. The people around you now, Margaret, your brother Thomas, little Emma, and her mother, they're my final gifts to you. Let them love you back to faith. Let their prayers carry you when you feel too weak. Remember that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's faith working through difficult questions toward deeper truth. I love you more than words can express. I'm waiting for you, but not impatiently. Take all the time you need. God's love is big enough to hold your questions, your anger, your fear. Trust that love, darling. It's the most real thing in any universe. All my love, always and forever, Sarah." Daniel wept openly, holding Sarah's letter against his chest. The woman he'd mourned as lost had been preparing for their separation with characteristic grace, ensuring that his spiritual journey would continue even without her physical presence. Her death hadn't been the end of their love story, but a transition to a different chapter, one where her influence operated through prayer rather than presence. "She loved you so much," Margaret said softly. "Even facing death, she was more concerned about your spiritual welfare than her own comfort." "I should have seen it," Daniel said. "Should have recognized what she was doing, supported her faith instead of dismissing it. You see it now. That's what matters." Sarah understood that some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived through, struggled with, earned through experience. That evening, Daniel called Thomas again. This time, their conversation flowed with the ease of restored intimacy. Two brothers reconnecting across years of misunderstanding. "I found Sarah's journal," Daniel said, "and letters she wrote for me to read after her death. She'd been praying for my spiritual journey, recruiting people to help me find my way back to faith." "That sounds like Sarah," Thomas said warmly. "She never gave up on anyone, but especially not on you. She called me 6 months before she died, asked me to keep reaching out no matter how you responded. She said you were going to need family, even if you didn't know it yet. I'm starting to understand that maybe grief and faith aren't opposites." Daniel said slowly, "Maybe they can coexist. Maybe losing someone you love can actually open you to loving something bigger." "Faith doesn't eliminate grief," Thomas agreed. "It transforms it. Instead of loss being the final word, it becomes part of a larger conversation about love and meaning and hope." They talked for another hour about doubt and belief, about the difference between intellectual assent and heart-level trust, about the possibility that Daniel's journey away from faith had been preparation for a deeper journey back toward it. After hanging up, Daniel returned to Sarah's journal. The final entries, written during her last weeks of lucidity, were filled with gratitude rather than complaints, hope rather than despair. I can feel myself letting go, and it's not terrifying the way I thought it would be. There's a peace that passes understanding, just like the scripture promises. I'm ready to see Jesus, ready to meet my parents and Daniel's parents, ready to wait for my husband to join me when his time comes. But first, Lord, please help him find his way home. Help him understand that this separation is temporary, that love really is stronger than death. Daniel closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of their bedroom. Sarah's presence felt tangible, not as ghost or imagination, but as continuing influence, love that transcended physical boundaries. Her prayers were still working. In his life, her faith still calling to his, her hope still beckoning him toward possibilities he'd dismissed as impossible. Emma's wooden cross sat on the nightstand beside Sarah's journal. Two symbols of faith, separated by generations, but united in their simple testimony that love was available. Help was possible, and hope could survive even the deepest losses. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, Daniel felt her death had meaning beyond tragedy. She'd used her final months to plant seeds that were now beginning to bloom, to arrange spiritual care that was drawing him back toward the faith they'd once shared. Her dying had been her final act of loving, her ultimate gift to the husband she'd known would struggle to believe without her. The journey back to faith was just beginning, but Daniel was no longer walking it alone. Sarah's prayers surrounded him like invisible armor. Her love called to him across whatever distance separated this world from the next, and her hope was becoming his own. The church bulletin fell from Sarah's jewelry box like a pressed flower, its edges yellowed with age, but the print still clear. First Methodist Church, May 15th, 1988. The wedding of Sarah Catherine Mitchell and Daniel Thomas Hayes. Their wedding day, 34 years ago, preserved in Sarah's most private space alongside her grandmother's pearls and his mother's engagement. Ring. Daniel carried the bulletin to the window, holding it up to catch the afternoon light. The service order was exactly as he remembered. Processional, scripture readings, exchange of vows that had included promises about honoring God together as husband and wife. At the time, those words had felt natural, effortless. He'd meant them completely, never imagining that life would gradually erode his ability to keep them. Pastor Reynolds had married them, a gentleman who'd known Daniel since childhood, who'd baptized him and confirmed him and counseled him through the typical struggles of young faith. The bulletin listed his meditation text. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Daniel had assumed the verse was about divorce, about the importance of marital commitment. Now he wondered if Pastor Reynolds had been thinking about other kinds of separation, the slow drift between spouses when one maintained faith and the other abandoned it. The memory of their wedding day surfaced with startling clarity. Sarah radiant in her grandmother's dress, her eyes bright with joy and certainty about their future together. The reception at the church fellowship hall, where his parents had danced to the same songs they'd played at their own wedding 40 years earlier. The quiet moment when Sarah had whispered in his ear during their first dance, "I can't wait to see what God has planned for us." What had God planned for them? 32 years of marriage that had been mostly good, marked by love and laughter, and the kinds of ordinary miracles that sustained long partnerships. Sarah's infertility had been their greatest sorrow, years of hoping and trying and medical interventions that never produced the children they dreamed of. But they built a different kind of family through church connections, mentoring relationships, and the quiet satisfaction of lives spent caring for others. Daniel's faith had begun to waver during those difficult years. He'd prayed desperately for children, bargained with God, promised increased devotion in exchange for the blessing of parenthood. When those prayers went unanswered, he'd slowly stopped believing that prayer worked at all. Sarah had grieved their childlessness, but never blamed God for it. Her faith had deepened through disappointment rather than diminishing. a response that had both inspired and frustrated him. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Emma stood in the hallway with Rebecca, both carrying what appeared to be a casserole dish covered with aluminum foil. "We brought you dinner," Emma announced. "Mommy says people need food when they're sad, and you looked sad at church yesterday." Had he looked sad? Daniel couldn't remember feeling particularly mournful during the service. Perhaps sadness had become so familiar that he wore it unconsciously, like a suit he'd forgotten he was wearing. "That's very thoughtful," he said, accepting the dish. "Would you like to come in for a few minutes?" Rebecca hesitated. "We don't want to intrude." "Please," Daniel said, surprising himself with the earnestness in his voice. "I'd welcome the company." They settled in his living room, Emma immediately drawn to the framed photographs on the side tables. She studied each one with careful attention, asking questions about the people and places captured in silver frames. "This lady is very pretty," she said, holding up a photo of Sarah from their anniversary trip to Tuscany. "Is she your wife who went to heaven?" "Yes, that's Sarah. How did you know she went to heaven?" Emma's expression grew serious. "Because she looks like the kind of person Jesus would want to have dinner with. And because you keep her pictures everywhere, which means you miss her, but you're not mad at her for leaving." The child's logic was startling in its clarity. Daniel had indeed filled the house with photographs of Sarah, but he'd never considered what that said about his feelings toward her or her death. Anger had been directed at God, at the unfairness of cancer, at the medical system that couldn't save her, but never at Sarah herself. "Do you think people who die can still help the people who miss them?" Emma asked, settling into the chair beside his with the casual familiarity of someone who'd never learned to be uncomfortable with difficult questions. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think they can," she said confidently. "My grandma died when I was little, but sometimes when I'm scared, I remember things she told me, and that helps. It's like she's still teaching me stuff, even though I can't see her anymore." Rebecca smiled at her daughter's simple theology. "Emma has very definite opinions about heaven and how it works." "Tell me more about your grandma," Daniel said to Emma. "She used to sing songs about Jesus when she tucked me in at night. And she said that when people love Jesus, they get to be with him when they die. But they also get to watch over the people they love who are still here. Like invisible helpers." Invisible helpers. Daniel thought about the series of coincidences that had brought Emma into his life. About Margaret's faithful prayers, about Thomas's persistent letters, about the journal and letters Sarah had prepared for his spiritual journey. Perhaps coincidence was the wrong word. Perhaps Emma's theology was more accurate than the complex doctrinal systems he'd studied in his youth. "Emma, remember when you gave me the wooden cross and said maybe God could help me?" She nodded solemnly. "How did you know I needed help?" "Because you had the same look my mommy had when Daddy left. Like you were carrying something too heavy, but you didn't want to put it down because then you'd have to think about why it was so heavy." Daniel exchanged glances with Rebecca, who shrugged with the resigned expression of a mother whose child routinely said things that adults needed years of therapy to understand. "What happened when your mommy stopped carrying the heavy thing?" Daniel asked. "She started coming to church with me, and Pastor Jin told her that God likes to carry heavy things for people who ask him to. So she asked, and then she wasn't so tired all the time." The conversation continued for another hour, ranging from Emma's observations about prayer to her theories about why God sometimes lets sad things happen to good people. Her answers lacked theological sophistication, but carried the ring of hard-won wisdom. Faith filtered through the experience of a child who'd navigated her own losses and found hope on the other side. After they left, Daniel returned to the wedding bulletin. The back page listed the wedding party, including Thomas's best man and Sarah's sister Ellen as matron of honor. Ellen lived in Seattle now, and they'd exchanged Christmas cards, but little else since Sarah's funeral. Like Thomas, she'd tried to reach out during those first months of grief, offering comfort that Daniel had been too raw to receive. He found Ellen's number in Sarah's address book and called before he could reconsider. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the same warmth he remembered from their wedding day. "Daniel, what a wonderful surprise. I was just thinking about you. Sarah's birthday is next month, and I always get a little melancholy around this time of year." "I've been thinking about her too," Daniel admitted. "I found some things, her journal, letters she wrote for me to read after she died. Ellen, she was praying for my spiritual journey, even while she was dying." "That sounds exactly like Sarah," Ellen said softly. "She never stopped believing that you'd find your way back to faith. She used to call me during those last months, asking me to pray for you, worried about how you'd handle grief without any spiritual foundation to stand on." "Did she ever tell you about her own struggles with faith? About times when she doubted?" Ellen was quiet for a moment. "You know, she did. Especially during your infertility years. There was a period when she wondered if God was punishing her for something, if she'd done something to deserve the disappointment of childlessness. But she worked through it. She told me once that doubt wasn't the opposite of faith. It was faith wrestling with difficult questions until it got stronger." That phrase again. Daniel was beginning to see a pattern in the way people of faith talked about doubt, not as failure or weakness, but as a natural part of spiritual growth, like growing pains that preceded increased strength. "She left me letters," Daniel said, "instructions about finding my way back to believing. It's like she planned my spiritual journey even after she was gone." "She loved you so much," Ellen said. "Even facing death, she was more concerned about your soul than her own suffering. I think that's what real love looks like, caring about someone's eternal welfare, even when you're facing temporal loss." They talked for another 30 minutes about Sarah's final months, about the peace that had characterized her dying, about the hope that had sustained her even when medical interventions failed. Ellen confirmed what Daniel was beginning to understand. Sarah's death had been her final act of loving, her ultimate gift to a husband she'd known would struggle to believe without her physical presence. That evening, Daniel returned to his mother's Bible, this time focusing on the New Testament passages Sarah had marked heavily during her final year. The Gospels were filled with her notations about doubt and faith, loss and resurrection, the promise that death wasn't the final word in the human story, die in the margins of John's Gospel. Beside the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, Sarah had written, "For Daniel, when he's ready to believe that love is stronger than death." The notation was dated just 2 weeks before her own death. Even then, facing her own mortality, she'd been thinking about his spiritual needs, marking passages that might speak to his grief and guide him toward hope. Daniel closed the Bible and walked to the window overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing someone's story of struggle and search, loss and recovery. He was no longer alone in that landscape. Sarah's prayers surrounded him like invisible arms. Her love called to him across whatever distance separated this world from the next, and her faith was slowly becoming his own. The wooden cross Emma had given him sat on the windowsill, catching the reflection of city lights. Such a simple symbol to carry such weight, such an ordinary gift to open such extraordinary possibilities. Daniel picked up the cross and held it to the light, remembering Emma's words about invisible helpers and the possibility that people who died could still care for those they loved. Maybe Sarah was still helping him find his way home. Maybe love really was stronger than death. Maybe a 7-year-old girl understood something about faith that a 58-year-old CEO was finally ready to learn. The journey back to believing was accelerating, each day bringing new evidence that his spiritual awakening wasn't coincidental but orchestrated by hands that had been guiding his path long before he'd been willing to acknowledge their presence. Sarah's final gift was unfolding exactly as she'd planned, slowly, gently, through the love of people who saw his need and responded with grace. For the first time since her death, Daniel felt grateful rather than angry about Sarah's influence in his life. She'd known him better than he'd known himself, loved him more than he'd understood, and prepared for their separation with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else in their marriage. Tomorrow he would call Pastor Williams at Community Fellowship. It was time to stop being a visitor in God's house and start considering whether he might be ready to come home. The medical report was tucked beneath Sarah's insurance papers, filed with the methodical precision that had characterized her approach to everything important. Daniel found it while searching for documentation Margaret needed for the memorial scholarship they were establishing in Sarah's name. The letterhead was familiar Dr. Morrison's oncology practice, but the date made his blood run cold. Patient Sarah Catherine Hayes. Date of service, August 18th. Preliminary findings: pancreatic adenocarcinoma, stage IIB. Prognosis: 4 to 6 months without intervention, 8 to 12 months with aggressive treatment. Patient advised of diagnosis and treatment options. Follow-up scheduled for August 25th. August 18th. Daniel stared at the date until the numbers burned into his memory. Sarah's diagnosis had come in August, not September, as she told him. She'd known about the cancer for 6 weeks before that terrible Tuesday, when she'd sat him down in their living room and destroyed their future with 8 quiet words. "Daniel, sweetheart, we need to talk about something serious." But this report suggested the conversation should have happened in August. Why had she waited? What had filled those missing 6 weeks? Daniel's hand shook as he searched through the remaining medical files. More reports emerged like evidence in a case he'd never known was being tried. August 25th. Patient adamant about delaying disclosure to spouse. Requests time to process diagnosis privately. September 2nd. Patient continues to request delayed disclosure. Has begun what she describes as spiritual preparation for end-of-life process. Spiritual preparation. While Daniel had been focused on quarterly projections and merger negotiations, Sarah had been preparing for death, alone. The betrayal felt physical, a knife between his ribs that left him gasping for breath. He called Dr. Morrison's office immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The receptionist was apologetic, but firm. The doctor was with patients. Could she take a message? Daniel's response was sharp enough that she agreed to interrupt Dr. Morrison between appointments. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Morrison's voice carried the careful tone of someone who delivered bad news for 30 years. "I wondered if you might eventually find those early reports." Sarah was very specific about wanting to control the timing of disclosure. "She lied to me for 6 weeks, Daniel said, the words coming out flat and accusatory. "My wife was dying, and she lied to me." "Your wife was protecting you," Dr. Morrison corrected gently. "She told me she needed time to make peace with her diagnosis before watching you try to fight something that couldn't be fought. She said you'd want to research experimental treatments, seek second opinions, turn her dying into a project you could manage. She wanted to spare you that frustration." The assessment was accurate enough to deepen Daniel's anger. He would have done exactly what Sarah had predicted: mobilized resources, consulted specialists, refused to accept any prognosis that included the word terminal. But that was his right as her husband, wasn't it? His responsibility as the person who loved her most? "What did she do during those 6 weeks?" Daniel asked. "She came in twice a week for counseling sessions with our social worker. She spent time at the church, talking with Pastor Williams about her fears and hopes. She wrote letters, made arrangements, prepared for things she knew you wouldn't be ready to discuss." "Mr. Hayes, Your wife faced her mortality with more grace than anyone I've ever treated. She used those weeks to ensure that her death would be as easy as possible for everyone who loved her." After hanging up, Daniel sat in his study surrounded by the evidence of Sarah's secret journey toward death. The timeline made terrible sense. Now, August, private diagnosis and spiritual preparation. September, disclosure to Daniel and beginning of their shared journey through treatment. November through March, the slow, inevitable progression toward the end she'd known was coming from the very beginning. Sarah had choreographed their final months together, protecting him from the full weight of her prognosis while privately preparing for the separation she knew was inevitable. Every conversation about experimental treatments, every hopeful discussion about remission possibilities, every moment when she'd seemed to rally and improve, all of it had been performance, designed to give him hope she'd never actually shared. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Their marriage, which he believed was built on honesty and mutual trust, had ended with the biggest lie of their lives together. Sarah had died knowing she was dying while allowing him to believe recovery was possible. She'd faced the ultimate crisis of their relationship alone, denying him the chance to walk that dark valley with her from the very beginning. Daniel's phone rang. Emma's bright voice filled the room like sunshine in a thunderstorm. "Mr. Daniel, Mommy said I could call you because we're making cookies for church tomorrow and we made extra ones for you. Do you want to come get them?" "I can't tonight, Emma." His voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Are you sad again? You sound sad." Sad was inadequate. Betrayed, angry, confused, hurt, those were closer to accurate. But how could he explain to a 7-year-old that the woman everyone held up as a model of faith and grace had spent her final months lying to the person who loved her most? "Sometimes adults get sad about grown-up things," he said carefully. "Do you want to talk to Jesus about it? Mommy says he's a good listener." "I don't think Jesus and I are on speaking terms right now, Emma." "But Mr. Daniel, Jesus likes it when people are mad at him. Pastor Jim says it means you still believe he's real, even when you don't like what he's doing." After Emma hung up, Daniel found himself staring at the wooden cross she'd given him weeks ago. Such a simple symbol of faith, now mocking him from its place on his desk. If God was real, if divine love was supposedly guiding human events, why had Sarah been forced to face her diagnosis alone? Why hadn't God given her a husband strong enough to handle the truth from the beginning? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through his newfound faith and destroying the tentative hope he'd been nurturing. Sarah's prayers for his spiritual journey seemed naive now. Her confidence in divine orchestration, nothing more than wishful thinking. Wrapped in religious language, he opened her journal to the early entries, reading them now with the knowledge that she'd been dying while she wrote them. The prayers for his spiritual welfare took on different meaning when viewed through the lens of her deception. Had she been praying for his faith because she'd known he would need it to survive her lies? August 20th. Told Dr. Morrison today that I need more time before telling Daniel. He thinks I'm in denial, but I'm not. I'm in preparation. God is giving me weeks to ready myself for the hardest conversation of our marriage. I know Daniel will want to fight this diagnosis, will exhaust himself researching treatments that won't change the outcome. I need to be strong enough to help him accept what I've already accepted, that sometimes love means letting go. August 25th. Met with Pastor Williams for 2 hours today. We talked about death as transition rather than ending, about the possibility that my dying might be God's way of preparing Daniel for a deeper relationship with faith. I've been praying for his spiritual awakening for years. What if my cancer is the crisis that finally opens his heart to divine love? It's a terrible thought, but also a hopeful one. The entries revealed a woman wrestling with impossible questions about suffering and purpose, about whether personal tragedy could serve spiritual ends. about the possibility that her death might be meaningful rather than random. Sarah had been thinking theologically about her cancer, viewing it as potential catalyst for Daniel's spiritual journey rather than simple medical catastrophe. The perspective was both inspiring and infuriating. How dare she turn her dying into spiritual strategy? How dare she use their final months together as opportunity for evangelism? The woman he'd mourned as saint was revealed as manipulator, orchestrating his grief for purposes he'd never consented to. Margaret's evening call found him in this dark space, surrounded by medical reports and journal entries that had rewritten everything he thought he knew about Sarah's final year. "Daniel, you sound terrible. What's happened?" He told her about the medical reports, about the 6 weeks of deception, about the realization that Sarah had been managing her death the same way she'd managed their social calendar, with careful planning and strategic omissions designed to achieve desired outcomes. "She lied to me, Margaret. For 6 weeks, she knew she was dying and said nothing. How am I supposed to reconcile that with all this talk about her faith and her prayers for my spiritual welfare?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Daniel, do you remember when Sarah was planning your surprise 50th birthday party? She lied to you for months about that, told you she'd forgotten your birthday, made up stories about being too busy to plan anything special. You were hurt and confused, convinced she didn't care. But the night of the party, when you saw what she'd actually been doing, how did you feel? That was different. That was a party, not terminal cancer. The principle is the same. Sarah lied to protect something precious, your ability to enjoy the time you had left together without the burden of hopelessness. She knew that once you learned the full truth, every moment would be colored by impending loss. She gave you 6 weeks of normal marriage while she prepared to give you the best possible version of dying. The comparison was logical but failed. To ease the sting of betrayal, a surprise party was momentary deception. Dying in secret was betrayal of the deepest vows of marriage. In sickness and in health, for better or for worse, Sarah had denied him the chance to honor those promises from the moment her illness became terminal. That night, Daniel dreamed of Sarah standing in their kitchen, humming while she made his coffee, carrying the secret of her diagnosis like stones in her pockets. He woke angry and confused, feeling like a stranger in his own grief story. But as the morning light filtered through their bedroom curtains, illuminating the photographs of their life together, Daniel began to consider Margaret's words more carefully. Sarah had indeed managed their final months with the same loving attention she'd given to everything else in their marriage. She'd protected him from despair while privately preparing for separation, ensured that their last conversations would be filled with hope rather than hopelessness. The betrayal was real, but so was the love that had motivated it. Sarah had chosen to carry the full weight of terminal diagnosis alone, rather than burden him with knowledge that would have destroyed their remaining time together. Her deception had been sacrifice. Her lies a final act of loving. Emma was right. Sometimes people could be mad at God and still believe he was real. Maybe the same was true about love. Maybe betrayal and devotion could coexist. Maybe lies could serve truth. Maybe dying could be the most loving thing a person could do for someone who wasn't ready to let go. The wooden cross sat on his nightstand. Besides Sarah's medical reports, symbol of faith shadowed by evidence of human complexity. Nothing was as simple as he thought, not Sarah's sainthood, not divine providence, not the clear distinctions between truth and deception, love and manipulation, but Emma's simple wisdom echoed in his memory. Jesus likes it when people are mad at him. It means you still believe he's real. Perhaps anger was closer to faith than indifference. Perhaps questions were more honest than easy answers. Perhaps Sarah's secret journey toward death was part of a larger story about love that transcended understanding, hope that survived betrayal, and grace that operated through human imperfection rather than despite it. The plot of his spiritual journey had taken an unexpected turn, but maybe That was the point. Maybe faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about continuing to ask questions even when the answers were more complicated than comfort could easily contain. The handwritten invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by Emma herself during what had become her weekly visit to Daniel's office. The construction paper was decorated with glitter and stickers, the kind of artistic effort that could only come from a 7-year-old's determined creativity. "You are invited to our Christmas pageant," Emma read aloud, her finger following each carefully formed word. "December 23rd at 7 p.m. Come see Jesus get born. Love, Emma and all the kids at Community Fellowship Church." Daniel studied the invitation, noting the childish drawings of angels and shepherds crowded around the margins. It had been nearly 2 weeks since his discovery of Sarah's medical deception. 2 weeks of wrestling with complicated emotions about love and lies, faith and betrayal. The anger had softened into something more manageable, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance that human love operated through imperfection rather than despite it. "Are you going to be in the pageant?" Daniel asked. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I'm an angel. I get to wear wings and tell the shepherds not to be afraid. Mrs. Patterson says angels are God's messengers, and they help people understand important things." "What important thing will you be helping people understand?" Emma's expression grew serious, as if she understood the weight of her role. "That God loves everybody, even when they're scared or sad or mad at him. That's why he sent Jesus to show people they don't have to be afraid of being loved." The simple theology carried more weight than the complex doctrinal discussions Daniel remembered from his youth. God sending love into human fear and confusion. Divine care reaching toward people who felt lost or abandoned or betrayed by life's circumstances. It was exactly the message Daniel needed to hear, though he wasn't sure he was ready to receive it. "Will you come?" Emma asked. "Please? I'll look for you in the audience, and it will make me feel brave to know you're there." The request touched something deep in Daniel's chest. When had anyone last needed his presence for courage? When had his attendance at anything mattered to someone who wasn't paid to care about his schedule? "I'll be there," he heard himself saying. After Emma and Rebecca left, Daniel found himself thinking about the significance of attending his first church service since that tentative Sunday 6 weeks ago. So much had changed in that brief span: his understanding of Sarah's final months, his relationship with Thomas, his growing awareness that his spiritual journey had been carefully orchestrated by people who loved him enough to pray for his awakening. Margaret knocked and entered with his afternoon coffee, noting the invitation propped against his computer monitor. "Emma's Christmas pageant? She's playing an angel. Apparently, I'm required to attend." Margaret smiled. "Required by whom?" "By a 7-year-old who thinks my presence will make her feel brave." "And will you go?" Daniel nodded, surprising himself with the certainty of his decision. "Yes, I think it's time." Time for what? To stop being a visitor in God's house and start considering whether I might be ready to come home. That evening, Daniel called Thomas to discuss his plans for attending the pageant. Their conversations had become weekly rituals, safe spaces for exploring questions about faith and doubt, grief and healing. A Christmas pageant, Thomas mused. Perfect place for someone wrestling with incarnation theology. Incarnation theology? The idea that God chose to enter human experience, not as conquering king or distant deity, but as vulnerable child. It's the heart of Christmas. The notion that divine love is willing to become as fragile and dependent as a baby. Daniel considered this as he watched snow begin to fall outside his study window. Divine vulnerability rather than divine power. God choosing weakness over strength, love over control. It aligned with his growing understanding that faith might be more about surrender than conquest, more about accepting help than providing it. "Thomas, do you think Sarah's deception about her diagnosis was wrong?" "I think Sarah was human, Thomas. replied carefully. I think she made the best decisions she could with impossible circumstances. Love doesn't always operate through perfect honesty, Daniel. Sometimes it operates through protective silence, through lies that serve truth larger than facts. That sounds like theological justification for dishonesty. Maybe. Or maybe it sounds like recognition that human relationships are complicated. That love sometimes requires choices between competing goods. Sarah chose to give you months of hope rather than months of despair. Was that wrong? I honestly don't know, but I know it came from love, not from selfishness. They talked for another hour about the complexity of human relationships, about the way love operated through imperfect people, making imperfect choices in impossible circumstances. Thomas shared stories from his pastoral experience families, navigating terminal illness, marriages surviving betrayal, faith communities wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Faith isn't about having perfect people follow perfect rules, Thomas said. It's about broken people finding grace sufficient for their brokenness. Sarah was broken by cancer. You're broken by grief. I'm broken by my own failures and limitations. The miracle isn't that we get fixed, it's that we get loved anyway. After hanging up, Daniel returned to his mother's Bible, this time focusing on the Christmas story itself. Luke's gospel painted a picture of divine love entering human experience through the most ordinary circumstances: young parents, unexpected pregnancy, birth in temporary shelter because there was no room anywhere else. In the margins beside the nativity narrative, his mother had written, God with us, even in the messiances, especially in the messiances. Even in the messiances. Sarah's secret cancer diagnosis, Daniel's crisis of faith, the complicated emotions that surrounded love and loss, and the possibility of hope beyond human understanding. Maybe divine love was most present not in perfect circumstances, but in the messy ones. Not when life made sense, but when it did single quotes to dot the week before the pageant brought a flurry of activity. Daniel found himself making preparations that went beyond simply attending a children's Christmas service. He called Pastor Williams to schedule a private conversation, something he'd been considering since discovering Sarah's journal entries about his spiritual welfare. The meeting took place in Pastor Williams's study on a Thursday afternoon. The church quiet except for the distant sound of choir practice in the sanctuary. Pastor Williams was younger than Daniel had expected, early 40s, with the kind of gentle presence that suggested deep listening skills and hard-won wisdom. Emma Chun tells me you're wrestling with faith questions, Pastor Williams said, settling into a chair across from Daniel's. She's quite concerned about your spiritual welfare. According to her, you're getting better at not being sad, but you still need to meet Jesus properly. Daniel almost smiled at Emma's assessment. She's been my unofficial spiritual advisor for several months now. I'm not sure what that says about the state of my faith, that I'm taking theological instruction from a 7-year-old. Children often understand things about God that adults have to relearn, Pastor Williams said. They trust without guarantees, love without conditions, believe in possibilities that seem impossible to more sophisticated minds. They talked for 2 hours about doubt and faith, about the difference between intellectual belief and heart-level trust, about the possibility that spiritual awakening often came through crisis rather than comfort. Pastor Williams listened without judgment as Daniel described his journey from convinced atheism through Sarah's death toward whatever he was becoming now. I don't know what I believe, Daniel admitted. I know something is happening in my life that feels larger than coincidence. I know people are praying for me, caring about my spiritual welfare in ways that touch me deeply. I know Emma's simple faith challenges assumptions I've carried for decades. But I don't know if that adds up to belief in God. What would belief in God look like for you? Pastor Williams asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. I suppose it would look like trust. Trust that love is stronger than death, that meaning can emerge from suffering, that the connections between people, the way Sarah arranged for my spiritual care, the way Emma saw my need before I acknowledged it, the way you're sitting here, listening to questions from a man who's spent years dismissing everything you stand for, that those connections aren't random but purposeful. And do you trust those things? I'm beginning to. I'm beginning to think that maybe Sarah's prayers for my spiritual journey weren't wishful thinking but actual communication with someone who was listening. I'm beginning to believe that Emma's gift of a wooden cross wasn't just childhood kindness, but divine intervention operating through innocent generosity. Pastor Williams nodded slowly. Faith isn't about certainty, Daniel. It's about acting on hope even when certainty isn't available. It's about choosing to trust divine love even when human love disappoints us. It's about believing that our stories are part of a larger narrative. That includes redemption and restoration and the possibility that death isn't the final word, even when that larger narrative includes cancer and betrayal and years of spiritual emptiness, especially then. The Christmas story is about God entering exactly those circumstances: poverty, political oppression, family crisis, uncertainty about the future. Divine love doesn't avoid human messiness. It enters it and transforms it from the inside. As Daniel prepared to leave, Pastor Williams offered him a small book, a simple devotional guide for people exploring faith. No pressure, he said, but if you want to continue this conversation privately, this might help. It's written for people who have more questions than answers. That night, Daniel sat in his study with Pastor Williams's book open beside his mother's Bible. The devotional was practical rather than theological, focused on prayer as conversation rather than performance, faith as relationship rather than intellectual assent. The entry for December 23rd, the day of Emma's pageant, was titled, God with Us. It began with a simple question. What would change in your life if you truly believed that divine love was present in your circumstances, not despite your struggles, but through them? Daniel closed the book and stared out at the city lights, thinking about the question. What would change if he believed that Sarah's death had been accompanied by divine presence rather than divine absence? What would be different if he trusted that his spiritual journey had been guided rather than random? How would his perspective shift if he accepted that love, both human and divine, operated through imperfection rather than perfection? The wooden cross Emma had given him sat on his desk, catching the lamplight. Tomorrow night he would sit in a church sanctuary and watch children tell the story of God entering human experience as vulnerable infant. He would look for Emma in her angel costume and try to feel brave enough to let her message about divine love reach whatever remained of his capacity for faith. For the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel Hayes was ready to stop being afraid of hope. He was ready to consider the possibility that his journey back to faith wasn't betrayal of his intelligence, but recovery of his heart. He was ready to meet Jesus properly, as Emma would say, and discover what it might mean to trust in love stronger than death. The pageant was tomorrow night. The next chapter of his spiritual story was about to begin. Community Fellowship Church had been transformed for the Christmas pageant. Soft lighting replaced the usual fluorescent fixtures, creating an atmosphere of reverent intimacy. Pine garland draped the altar, and candles flickered from every windowsill. The sanctuary was filled beyond its usual capacity, families with small children, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers pressed into service as ushers and sound technicians. Daniel arrived 20 minutes early, clutching the program Emma had personally delivered to his office that afternoon. She'd drawn a star next to her name in the cast list and written "Look for me" in purple crayon across the top. Margaret had offered to attend with him, understanding somehow that this evening represented more than casual entertainment for him. They found seats in the fourth row, close enough to see Emma's face, but far enough back to allow for quick retreat if emotional overwhelm required it. Nervous? Margaret asked, noting the way Daniel's hands fidgeted with the program. I haven't been in a church sanctuary for anything but weddings and funerals in 20 years, he admitted. And those were obligations, not choices. This feels different. Different how? Daniel considered the question as families continued filing into the pews around them. Children whispered excitedly about their roles. Parents adjusted costumes and reminded young performers about their lines. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and joy, the kind of community celebration that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. Different because I want to be here, he said finally. Because a 7-year-old girl invited me, and her invitation feels like something I've been waiting for without knowing it. The lights dimmed, and Pastor Williams stepped forward to welcome the congregation. His words were simple, heartfelt, designed to honor both the children's efforts and the sacred story they were about to retell. Tonight we gathered to hear again the story that changed everything, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed sanctuary. The story of God choosing to enter human experience not as conquering hero, but as vulnerable child. It's a story about divine love meeting human need, about hope arriving in the most unexpected ways, about the possibility that no one, no matter how lost or lonely or convinced they're beyond help, is outside the reach of grace. Daniel felt the words settle into his chest like seeds finding fertile ground. Divine love meeting human need. Hope arriving in unexpected ways. Grace reaching toward people convinced they were beyond help. The description felt personal, as if Pastor Williams was speaking directly to his particular circumstances. The pageant began with the familiar story of Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem. The young actors moved through their roles with the earnest concentration of children determined to get every detail right. 8-year-old Mary rode a hobby horse donkey, while 10-year-old Joseph knocked on imaginary doors, seeking shelter for his pregnant wife. But it was the angel's announcement that caught Daniel's breath. Emma appeared at the side of the sanctuary, dressed in white robes with gossamer wings, her small face shining with excitement and purpose. She spoke her lines with the clarity of someone who believed every word. Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Fear not. The ancient words carried new weight when spoken by a child who had spent months telling a grieving CEO that maybe God could help his sadness. Emma's angel voice seemed to speak directly to the fear that had controlled Daniel's life. Since Sarah's death, fear of hope, fear of vulnerability, fear of believing in anything beyond his own control. The shepherds responded to Emma's announcement with the wonder of children genuinely amazed by the story they were telling. They hurried to the makeshift stable where baby Jesus lay in a wooden manger, surrounded by Mary and Joseph, and an assortment of farm animals played by the younger Sunday school classes. As Daniel watched the familiar narrative unfold, he found himself seeing it with fresh eyes. This wasn't the sanitized Christmas story of greeting cards and department store displays. This was a story about real people facing impossible circumstances, unexpected pregnancy, government oppression, homelessness, the vulnerability of bringing new life into a dangerous world. Yet the story's power lay not in avoiding these harsh realities, but in claiming that divine love was present within them. God hadn't chosen to enter human experience through wealth and power and safety. Divine love had come through poverty and uncertainty and the kind of circumstances that tested faith rather than confirming it. The wise men's arrival provided the pageant's climactic moment. 3 older children, dressed in elaborate robes and carrying glittering gifts, knelt before the manger and offered their treasures to the newborn king. Their gifts were simple: a jewelry box for gold, a small bottle for frankincense, a wooden box for myrrh, but their reverence was genuine. We have traveled far to find the one who will change everything, the first wise man announced. "We bring gifts, but we receive something more precious, the knowledge that love has come into the world. Love has come into the world." Daniel felt tears begin to blur his vision as the simple phrase penetrated defenses he'd built over decades of disappointment and loss. Emma's angel message had addressed his fear. The wise men's declaration spoke to his longing for meaning beyond material success. The pageant concluded with all the children joining together to sing Silent Night. Their voices were young and imperfect, but their sincerity was undeniable. Emma caught Daniel's eye during the final verse and smiled with such pure joy that his remaining emotional barriers simply dissolved as the congregation rose for the closing prayer. Daniel found himself standing not out of politeness but from genuine desire to participate. Pastor Williams's benediction felt like personal blessing rather than generic religious formula. May the God who chose to enter our world as vulnerable child continue to enter your life in ways that bring healing to your hurt, hope to your despair, and love to your loneliness. May you recognize divine presence not only in moments of celebration, but in times of struggle, not only when life makes sense, but especially when it doesn't. And may you go from this place knowing that you are beloved, that your story matters, and that no separation, not even death, can overcome the love that created you and sustains you still. Daniel remained in his seat as families began filing out, needing a moment to process what had just occurred. The pageant had been simple, children's theater, but something profound had shifted inside him. The Christmas story wasn't just ancient history, it was present reality. Divine love continuing to enter human experience through unexpected messengers, like 7-year-old girls with wooden crosses and simple invitations to believe. Emma appeared. Beside his pew, still wearing her angel wings, her face flushed with excitement and accomplishment. "Did you see me, Mr. Daniel? Did I do good being an angel?" "You were a perfect angel, Emma. The best angel I've ever seen." "Did the story make you feel happy? Did you like learning about baby Jesus?" Daniel knelt to Emma's eye level, wanting her to see the sincerity in his response. "Emma, that story did make me feel happy and grateful. And something else I haven't felt in a long time." "What?" "Hopeful. Your angel message about not being afraid. I think I'm finally ready to stop being afraid." Emma's smile could have powered the church's Christmas lights. She threw her arms around Daniel's neck with the unself-conscious affection of a child who had successfully completed her mission. "I knew Jesus would help you not be sad anymore," she whispered in his ear. "I prayed for that every night." As Emma skipped away to rejoin her mother, Daniel sat back in the pew and closed his eyes. The sanctuary was nearly empty now, the magic of the evening settling into quiet contentment. Margaret waited patiently beside him, understanding that something significant had just occurred. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Different," Daniel said, the word carrying weight of recognition and relief. "Like I've been holding my breath for 2 years and finally remembered how to exhale." The program from Emma's pageant lay in his lap, her purple crayon star still visible beside her name. Such a simple invitation to witness an ancient story. But it had become the moment when his spiritual journey shifted from tentative exploration to genuine commitment. Daniel Hayes had come to Community Fellowship Church as a grieving widower wrestling with doubt and anger. He was leaving as someone ready to believe again, ready to trust that love really was stronger than death, ready to accept that his story, Sarah's death, Emma's friendship, Margaret's prayers, Thomas's persistence, was part of a larger narrative that included redemption and restoration and hope. "Fear not," Emma's angel voice echoed in his memory. "For unto you is born this day a Savior." For the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel believed those words were meant for him. After the sanctuary had mostly emptied, Emma returned to Daniel's pew carrying a small card decorated with her characteristic glitter and stickers. She'd removed her angel wings, but still wore the white robe that made her look ethereal in the church's candlelight. "This is for you," she said, pressing the card into his hands with ceremony. "Mrs. Patterson helped me write it, but the words are mine." Daniel opened the card carefully. Inside, in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting, "Dear Mr. Daniel, thank you for coming to see Jesus get born. I prayed every night that you would come and that your heart would feel happy again. Jesus loves you very much, and so do I love Emma, your angel friend." Below her signature, Emma had drawn a simple picture of 2 figures standing beneath a large cross, just like the drawing she'd given him months ago. But this version included details that hadn't been in the original: a star shining above the cross, angels in the corners, and what appeared to be a third figure with outstretched arms standing between the cross and the 2 people below. "Who is this?" Daniel asked, pointing to the middle figure. "That's Jesus," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "He's standing between you and the sad feelings, so they can't hurt you anymore. Pastor Jim says that's what Jesus does. He stands between people and the things that make them scared or lonely." The theology was simple, but it captured something profound about the protection Daniel had begun to feel over the past months. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something more manageable, buffered by the love of people who cared about his welfare and by the growing sense that he wasn't navigating loss alone. Pastor Williams approached their pew, still wearing his Christmas tie and carrying a small wrapped package. "Daniel, I'm so glad you came tonight. Emma told me she'd been praying specifically for your attendance." "She's been praying for more than my attendance," Daniel said, looking down at the card in his hands. "She's been praying for my heart to feel happy again." "And does it?" Daniel considered the question carefully. The sanctuary around them felt sacred in ways that went beyond denominational tradition or architectural beauty. It felt like a place where honest questions were welcomed, where broken people could find healing, where stories of hope were still believed and shared. "It feels different," he said finally. "Lighter, like I've been carrying something heavy without realizing it, and tonight someone helped me set it down." Pastor Williams nodded with the understanding of someone who'd witnessed many spiritual awakenings. "Would you like to talk about what happens next? About what this feeling might mean for your faith journey?" "I think I'd like that very much." They moved to Pastor Williams's study, leaving Margaret to chat with other church members in the fellowship hall. Emma had been swept away by her mother for post-pageant celebration, but not before extracting a promise from Daniel that he would come to church again soon. The study felt different than it had during Daniel's previous visit. More welcoming, less intimidating. Pastor Williams settled into his chair with the relaxed posture of someone concluding a successful evening, and Daniel found himself feeling genuinely comfortable for the first time in a church setting since childhood. "Tell me what you experienced tonight," Pastor Williams said. "I felt like the story was being told to me personally," Daniel began slowly. "Not as ancient history, but as present reality. When Emma announced that fear shouldn't control people because God had sent love into the world, it felt like she was speaking directly to the fear I've lived with since Sarah died. What have you been afraid of?" "Hope, I think. Afraid of believing in anything beyond my own control. Afraid of trusting that life might have meaning beyond what I can measure and manage. Sarah's death shattered my confidence that good things last, that love is stronger than loss, that any story can have a happy ending." Pastor Williams reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden object, a prayer card holder carved in the shape of a cross. "This belonged to my grandfather, who lost his wife during the influenza pandemic of 1918. He was a young pastor then, and her death nearly destroyed his faith. But he told me once that the difference between losing faith and deepening faith isn't whether you experience doubt, it's what you do with the doubt when it comes." He handed Daniel the prayer card holder. "He carried this for 60 years after her death. not as superstition, but as reminder that questions and faith can coexist. That love continues, even when its object is no longer visible. Daniel turned the small cross over in his hands, feeling the smoothness that came from decades of handling. What did he do with his doubt? He prayed through it. He served others who were wrestling with similar losses. He chose to believe that his wife's death was part of a larger story that included resurrection and reunion, even when he couldn't see evidence for that hope. And gradually, over many years, that choice to believe became genuine conviction. How do I make that choice? How do I choose to believe when my rational mind still lists all the reasons faith might be self-deception? Pastor Williams smiled. The same way you chose to come here tonight when your rational mind probably listed all the reasons you should stay home. Faith isn't about eliminating doubt. It's about acting on hope even when certainty isn't available. They talked for another hour about the practical aspects of faith, what prayer might look like for someone beginning to believe, how to read Scripture with honest questions, what church membership could offer beyond social obligation. Pastor Williams was patient with Daniel's concerns about hypocrisy, about claiming faith he wasn't sure he possessed, about joining a community that might expect certainty he couldn't provide. Faith isn't a membership requirement, Pastor Williams assured him. It's a growing relationship. You don't have to believe everything at once, and you certainly don't have to pretend convictions you don't have. You just have to be willing to keep asking questions and remain open to answers you might not expect. As their conversation wound down, Pastor Williams reached into another drawer and produced a simple prayer card, the kind used for daily devotions. This is what I'd like to give you, not as religious homework, but as starting point for conversation with God. Daniel read the card's simple text. God, I'm not sure what I believe, but I'm willing to believe. Help my unbelief become faith. Help my questions lead to relationship. Help my doubt become trust. Amen. Is it that simple? It's that honest. God doesn't need perfect faith from you, Daniel. He needs honest faith. The willingness to admit you don't have all the answers, but you're open to discovering them. As Daniel prepared to leave, Pastor Williams offered one final thought. Your wife Sarah spent her final months praying for this moment, not just for your attendance at church, but for your willingness to consider that maybe love really is stronger than death. Tonight, watching you during the pageant, I think I saw the beginning of an answer to her prayers. Daniel walked to his car through the church parking lot, now mostly empty, except for a few families still organizing costumes and props. The December air was crisp and clear, with stars visible above the city lights. He felt different than he had when arriving 2 hours earlier, not completely transformed, but genuinely changed. The spiritual journey that had begun with Emma's wooden cross was reaching a new milestone dot in his pocket. He carried the prayer card Pastor Williams had given him and the card Emma had made celebrating his attendance at the pageant. Two different expressions of the same hope that he was loved, that his story mattered, that the sadness Emma had recognized months ago was finally giving way to something healthier. As Daniel drove home through the quiet city streets, he found himself speaking aloud the prayer from Pastor Williams's card. God, I'm not sure what I believe, but I'm willing to believe. Help my unbelief become faith. The words felt natural, not forced or artificial. For the first time in decades, Daniel Hayes was praying not out of desperation or bargaining, but from genuine desire for relationship with whatever divine love had been pursuing him through Emma's friendship, Margaret's faithfulness, Thomas's persistence, and Sarah's posthumous care. The journey back to faith was far from complete, but tonight had marked a crucial turning point. Daniel was no longer wrestling with God from a distance. He was ready to wrestle up close, in relationship, with the possibility that his questions might lead to answers, his doubt to trust, his grief to something that resembled hope. Emma had been right all along. Maybe God really could help, 6 months later, Daniel's Sunday morning routine bore little resemblance to the hollow rituals that had sustained him through 2 years of grief. He woke naturally at 7, without the pharmaceutical assistance that had once been necessary for sleep. The empty house no longer felt like a mausoleum. Sarah's photographs still graced every room, but they spoke of celebration rather than loss, memory rather than mourning. The new wooden cross sat on his nightstand beside Sarah's jewelry box, purchased not to replace Emma's gift, but to honor it. The child's simple offering had been the catalyst for his spiritual awakening. His own cross represented the choice to continue that journey independently. It was larger than Emma's, carved from olive wood his brother Thomas had brought back from a Holy Land pilgrimage, but it carried the same essential message. Love was stronger than death. Hope was more powerful than despair. And faith could flourish even in the soil of sorrow. Daniel dressed for church with the same care he'd once reserved for board meetings. Not from obligation, but from anticipation. Community fellowship had become more than Sunday destination. It was spiritual home, a place where his questions were welcomed and his gradual awakening was celebrated rather than hurried. The drive to church took him past the cemetery where Sarah rested beneath a simple stone that bore her name, the dates, and the inscription they'd chosen together years earlier: beloved wife and faithful friend. Daniel no longer avoided the cemetery. He visited monthly, bringing fresh flowers and news about his spiritual journey. He talked to Sarah as if she could hear him, sharing his progress through doubt toward faith, his growing understanding that her death had been transition rather than ending. "I'm becoming the man you prayed I'd become," he told her during his most recent visit. "I still have questions, and I probably always will. But I'm learning to ask them in relationship rather than isolation." Emma was right. God can help. He's been helping all along. Community Fellowship's packing lot was fuller than usual Easter. Sunday brought families who attended only on major holidays, alongside regular members who gathered weekly for worship and fellowship. Daniel recognized most faces now, had learned the names of children and grandchildren, knew which families were celebrating milestones and which were navigating crises. Emma met him at the sanctuary entrance, no longer the shy 7-year-old who'd offered him a wooden cross in his office 8 months earlier. She was still small, still prone to theological observations that carried more wisdom than their simplicity suggested, but she'd grown more confident in their friendship. She hugged him with the comfortable affection of someone who'd successfully completed an important mission. "Happy Easter, Mr. Daniel. Are you excited about Jesus coming back to life?" "Very excited, Emma. Are you singing with the children's choir today?" "We're singing Christ the Lord is risen today, and I get to sing the Alleluia parts really loud because Mrs. Patterson says Alleluia means praise God, and we should praise God with everything we have." Daniel had learned to love Emma's interpretations of theological concepts, her understanding of Easter as celebration rather than obligation, her confidence that death wasn't the final word in any story worth telling, her conviction that praising God with everything you had was the natural response to recognizing divine love. All of it had helped reshape his own relationship with faith. Rebecca appeared beside them, dressed in spring colors that reflected the optimism that had gradually replaced the worry lines around her eyes. The single mother who'd once struggled to balance work and parenting had found community support that eased both burdens. Daniel had played a small role in that transformation, promoting her to regional manager and helping arrange childcare assistance through the church's family ministry program. "Daniel, I wanted you to know that Emma's been praying for your brother Thomas," Rebecca said. "She heard you mention his diabetes, and she's added him to her bedtime prayer list." The casual way Rebecca shared this information reflected how natural prayer had become in Emma's life, how easily she assumed the people she cared about deserved divine attention. Thomas would be touched to know that a 7-year-old in New York was interceding for his health in Indiana. The sanctuary had been decorated for Easter with lily and flowing banners that proclaimed, "He is risen," in gold letters. The atmosphere was festive rather than solemn, celebrating victory rather than mourning loss. Daniel found his usual seat fourth row, center section, where he could see Emma in the children's choir and maintain easy conversation with the members who'd become genuine friends. Margaret slipped into the pew beside him, carrying a small gift bag decorated with Easter ribbons. "From Thomas," she explained, handing him the bag. "He sent it to the office with instructions to give it to you this morning." Inside was a leather bookmark, handmade by one of Thomas's parishioners, with Daniel's name embossed in simple script. A note in Thomas's handwriting was attached. "For your Bible reading journey. Proud of you, brother. Grateful for Sarah's prayers that brought you home. Love, Thomas." The bookmark was both practical and symbolic, Thomas's recognition that Daniel's faith had progressed from tentative exploration to committed practice. The devotional reading that had begun as spiritual experiment had become daily rhythm. Conversation with God that anchored each morning and evening. Pastor Williams stepped forward to offer the Easter greeting, his voice carrying across the sanctuary. Filled with people hungry for hope. "Christ is risen," he announced, and the congregation's response thundered back. "He is risen indeed." Daniel's voice joined the affirmation without hesitation. He believed those words now, not as historical fact requiring intellectual assent, but as present reality offering personal hope. Christ's resurrection wasn't just ancient event. It was continuing promise that death couldn't overcome love, that endings could become beginnings, that stories interrupted by loss could be completed by grace. The service proceeded with readings from Scripture that Daniel had studied carefully during his spiritual journey. Paul's letter to the Corinthians about resurrection hope, the gospel accounts of Easter morning discovery, the promise that death had been swallowed up in victory. Months earlier, these would have seemed like wishful thinking designed to comfort people too weak to face reality. Now they felt like truth too important to dismiss, hope too powerful to ignore. Emma's children's choir performed their Easter song with enthusiasm that made up for any technical imperfections. Their young voices proclaiming Christ the Lord is risen today carried conviction that moved even the most reserved adults to smiles. Daniel watched Emma sing her Alleluia parts with everything she had, just as she'd promised, and felt his own heart lifting in response. During the communion service, Daniel participated for the first time since his confirmation 40 years earlier. Pastor Williams had spent weeks preparing him for this moment, explaining the sacrament as symbol of divine love rather than religious obligation, invitation to relationship rather than test of worthiness. As Daniel received the bread and cup, Pastor Williams spoke words that seemed personally crafted. The body of Christ, given for you. The blood of Christ, shed for you. For you. Not for humanity in general. Not for people more deserving than a CEO who'd spent decades dismissing faith, but for him specifically. Divine love personal enough to include his particular grief, his specific questions, his individual journey from skepticism to belief. The service concluded with the congregation singing Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had moved Daniel during his first tentative visit to community fellowship months earlier. But this time, he sang with full voice, meaning every word about grace that had found him despite his resistance, about blindness that had given way to sight, about fear that had been replaced by faith. After the service, Emma presented him with another handmade card, this one featuring a drawing of an empty tomb with a figure in white standing beside it. "Happy Easter, Mr. Daniel," was written in her careful script. "Jesus is alive, and so is your happy heart." As families began filing out of the sanctuary, Daniel remained in his pew for a few extra moments, absorbing the significance of what had transpired over the past 8 months. The man who'd entered Emma's simple offering of a wooden cross as intrusion into his controlled world was gone. replaced by someone willing to believe in mysteries that couldn't be measured, hope that survived evidence to the contrary, love that transcended human understanding. The journey wasn't complete faith, remained more process than destination, more relationship than achievement. But Daniel was no longer walking alone through grief and doubt. He was accompanied by divine presence that operated through human community, sustained by prayers both living and remembered, guided by love that had been pursuing him long before he'd been willing to acknowledge its existence. That afternoon, Daniel visited Sarah's grave carrying Easter lily and news of his morning worship experience. He knelt beside her headstone and spoke aloud the words he'd been saving for this moment. "I found my way back, Sarah, not to the faith we had when we were young, but to something deeper. Something that can hold questions and certainty together. That can transform grief into gratitude. That can make sense of your death as part of a larger story about love and resurrection and hope." He placed Thomas's bookmark in his Bible and opened to the passage Pastor Williams had referenced in his Easter sermon. "Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" The words no longer felt like empty religious consolation. They felt like promise kept, victory claimed, hope realized through the patient love of people who'd refused to let him walk alone. Emma's wooden cross had been the beginning. Thomas's bookmark marked the next chapter. Sarah's prayers continued to unfold in ways that honored her faith and blessed his journey. Daniel Hayes had come home to belief, not through argument or evidence, but through relationship. Through a 7-year-old girl who saw sadness and offered hope. Through a brother who persisted across years of silence. Through a community that welcomed questions and celebrated tentative faith. Through a wife whose dying had been her final act of loving, whose prayers were still being answered in ways that testified to love's victory over death. The wooden cross Emma had given him so many months ago sat on his desk at home, polished, smoothed by grateful handling. Beside it lay her latest card, with its drawing of an empty tomb and its declaration that Jesus was alive and so was his. Happy heart. Emma had been right from the beginning. God could help. God had helped. God would continue helping as Daniel's faith journey continued beyond Easter into whatever seasons lay ahead. The sadness was gone, replaced by something stronger than happiness, a deep peace that passed understanding. The settled conviction that his story was part of a larger narrative that included redemption and restoration, and the promise that love really was stronger than death. Daniel's resurrection had begun with a child's gift and a wooden cross. It was being completed through community and grace, and the gradual understanding that some endings were actually beginnings. Some losses were actually discoveries, and some deaths like Sarah's, like Christ's, opened doors to life more abundant than anything that had come before.